The gentle hum of our alarm roused me awake, casting soft shadows across our bedroom as the morning light started to peek through the blinds. Rob's arm lay draped over me, warm and heavy. I could feel his breath, steady and peaceful, just brushing against my neck, and it was comforting in that effortless, familiar way that years together had created between us. In the quiet of our room, I let my mind drift back to when we first met, those whirlwind college days when we were both young, broke, and hungry for everything life had to offer. Back then, Rob was the kind of man everyone noticed, a bit rough around the edges but thoughtful, and surprisingly kind for his looks. He swept me off my feet, all charm and unexpected tenderness. We had spent entire nights talking about our dreams, our fears, our silly plans for the future. We were each other's adventure then. But now, 10 years later, I felt that spark fading. I loved Rob. I loved him fiercely, in a way that felt like breathing. But there was something inside me, a restless, unnameable ache that gnawed at me in quiet moments like this one. I tried to bury it, convince myself that it was just the lull of routine, but it never really went away. And lately, it had been growing louder, harder to ignore, like a soft but relentless drumbeat. "Good morning." Rob's groggy voice interrupted my thoughts as he stirred beside me. He pulled me in closer, wrapping his arms around me, his fingers tracing light, familiar circles on my back. I smiled, leaning into him. "Good morning," I replied, my voice muffled against his shoulder. "You're quiet," he murmured after a beat, pulling back slightly to look at me. His eyes, sleepy and warm, searched my face. "Is something on your mind?" I opened my mouth to answer, but hesitated. There was no easy way to put into words what I was feeling. How could I explain to the man I loved that even with him by my side, I sometimes felt like I was living on autopilot? How could I tell him that I longed for excitement, for a taste of something different, without making it sound like he wasn't enough? "It's nothing," I replied eventually, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "Just thinking about work." He studied me for a moment, as if trying to gauge the truth of my words, before he nodded, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "Well, don't stress too much. It's Saturday." I nodded, letting the comfort of his presence wash over me, hoping it would soothe the ache that had taken root in my chest. But as the morning wore on, that ache only seemed to grow, filling every quiet corner of my mind. I spent the day trying to shake off the feeling, telling myself over and over that I was just going through a phase. I folded laundry, sorted mail, ran the usual errands, anything to distract myself. But my mind kept slipping back to the same restless thoughts, like my brain was stuck on a loop I couldn't break. Every task I completed left a hollow echo, a feeling that I was simply ticking off boxes on a list rather than actually living. What was wrong with me? I had a good life, a stable marriage. Rob and I had been through so much together, shared years of late-night talks, holidays, inside jokes, a life built side by side. But over the past few months, something intangible had started to shift, like a steady hum beneath the surface of our daily routines. It was subtle, a whisper of dissatisfaction that had gradually grown louder, until it felt almost deafening in the silence of my own mind. Then one headline caught my eye. "The Open Marriage: Reignite Your Relationship Without Losing It." I stared at the title, my thumb hovering over the link. An open marriage? The idea felt absurd. Rob and I had always been committed to each other, had always prided ourselves on our trust and loyalty. We weren't the type of people to entertain something so unconventional, were we? But as I sat there in the dim light of the living room, I felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the article. Part of me scoffed at the idea that reading it would make any difference. And yet, there was a part of me that was curious, a small, rebellious voice in the back of my mind whispering, "What if?" With a resigned sigh, I tapped the link, letting the article load. The first few paragraphs were full of the usual promises of self-help articles. Feeling stuck? Feeling lost? Rediscover your partner by rediscovering yourself. But as I read further, the author began to unpack the idea of an open marriage in a way that was surprisingly compelling. According to them, it wasn't about a lack of love or commitment. In fact, many couples who pursued this kind of relationship did so because they were deeply committed to one another. The article described how an open marriage could offer a renewed sense of individuality. It was about allowing each partner to grow, to experience parts of themselves they might have set aside over the years of their relationship. The idea wasn't necessarily to go out and replace one another, but to expand together, allowing each person the freedom to seek experiences that might enrich, rather than undermine, the love they shared. An open marriage is not for the faint of heart, the author cautioned. It requires communication, trust, and a willingness to embrace vulnerability. It's not about what you're lacking, it's about discovering what more your relationship can be. My eyes scanned over the words again and again. I kept telling myself that I didn't need this. Rob and I were solid. We didn't need something drastic to reignite our relationship. And yet, as I read on, I felt the same quiet thrill I'd felt in those first few months of being with Rob, a sense of excitement, of possibility, of stepping into something unknown. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that. The article went on to describe couples who claimed that this kind of relationship had brought them closer, that the freedom and openness had enriched their marriage, allowing them to return to each other with a renewed sense of love and appreciation. The concept was both strange and enticing. Was it possible, I wondered, to have both the security of my marriage and the freedom to rediscover myself? Could Rob and I explore this without jeopardizing everything we had built together? As I scrolled through the comments, I saw story after story from people who had tried it. Some spoke of it as a revelation, a way to keep love fresh, vibrant, even after decades together. Others were cautionary tales, accounts of jealousy, hurt, and regret that hadn't been so easily soothed. My heart pounded as I read, captivated by both sides of the story. I found myself thinking back to the last time Rob and I had gone out together, just the two of us. It had been a nice night, a quiet dinner at a familiar restaurant, but there was a sense of routine about it. I could almost predict every step of the evening, what he would order, the topics we'd discuss, the way we'd eventually head home and settle into our usual bedtime rituals. It wasn't that I wanted anything different. I loved him, and I loved the life we'd built. But I couldn't ignore the restlessness that crept in, the feeling that life was slipping by, one day blurring into the next. In those early days of our relationship, everything had felt charged, electric. I remembered the thrill of getting dressed up, the flutter of nerves before our dates, the way we'd talk for hours as if we were discovering each other for the first time with every conversation. I missed that feeling, and I missed the part of myself that had been so alive, so eager for each moment. Had that spark gone because we'd grown comfortable, or was it something that time and routine had quietly eroded? Before I knew it, I'd read through the article twice. I sat there in the silence of the living room, feeling the weight of my own desires and the strange sense of guilt that accompanied them. The thought of proposing something so bold, so unconventional, felt ridiculous, like a scene out of a movie or a poorly written drama. I could already imagine Rob's face if I brought it up, the way his eyes would widen with shock, maybe even hurt. But then, as I sat there, I thought of all the couples who had taken this leap, the stories of love that had survived even after challenging traditional boundaries. What if this was exactly what we needed? What if it could give us both a chance to rediscover ourselves, to bring new experiences back into our relationship without tearing it apart? The more I thought about it, the more a small, rebellious part of me wanted to try. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, a chance to shake things up, to rekindle the parts of ourselves we'd set aside in the name of stability. What if we could have both, the stability and the excitement, the commitment and the freedom? I closed my eyes, imagining what it would be like to have that conversation with Rob, to see his reaction. Part of me worried he would see it as a betrayal, that he would feel as though I were asking for something because he wasn't enough. But another part of me, the part that had read every line of that article with an open mind and heart, dared to believe that he might understand, that he might see this as an opportunity for us to grow together, even as we explored new aspects of ourselves. The thoughts whirled in my mind, mingling with hope and fear, excitement and doubt. I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back, a choice that would change everything. And yet, as I turned off my phone and sat in the darkness, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This restlessness, this longing for something more, wasn't going to fade on its own. It was something I needed to confront, not just for myself, but for the life Rob and I had built together. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for a conversation that neither of us could have predicted. Dinner that night was quiet, with Rob and I both immersed in our own thoughts. I kept stealing glances at him across the table, my mind racing with the words I wanted to say, the questions I wanted to ask. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, fear held me back. After a while, he looked up, meeting my gaze with a warm, slightly puzzled smile. "You've been in your head all day," he observed, his tone gentle but probing. "Is there something going on?" I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it. If I didn't say something now, I'd never say it. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to meet his eyes, willing myself to be brave. "Rob," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, about us, about our relationship." He nodded, his expression attentive but wary. "Okay, what's on your mind?" "It's just," I trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "We've been together for so long, and I love you, Rob. I love you so much. But sometimes I feel like we're stuck in this routine, like we're just coasting." He frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "Coasting?" "Yes," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's like we're going through the motions, doing the same things over and over. And I know that's part of being in a long-term relationship, but sometimes I feel like I'm losing a part of myself. I miss feeling excited, feeling alive." He was silent, his gaze searching my face. "And what are you saying?" he asked finally, his voice cautious. "I'm saying..." I hesitated, then took a deep breath, forcing myself to push forward. "I think we should consider opening our marriage." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and surreal. Rob's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what I'd just said. "An open marriage?" he repeated slowly, as if trying to make sense of the concept. "You mean seeing other people?" "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think it could be a way for us to explore new things, to feel more connected to ourselves, and maybe even to each other." He looked away, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he was going to stand up and walk out. But after a long silence, he turned back to me, his eyes dark and filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "After all this time, why would you want to do this now?" I swallowed, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "Because I feel like I'm losing myself, Rob, and I don't want to feel that way anymore. I want us to be happy, truly happy, and I think this could be a way to find that happiness." He shook his head, looking down at his hands. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice strained. "I don't know if I can share you with someone else." "I understand," I said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "And I don't want to hurt you, but I also don't want to spend the rest of our lives feeling like we're missing something. If we do this, we'd do it together, with honesty and boundaries, but only if it's something we both want." He was silent for a long time, his hand warm in mine. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, meeting my gaze with a weary, resigned look. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll try, but only because I love you. And if this doesn't work, if it starts to tear us apart, I need you to promise me that we'll stop." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. "I promise," I said, squeezing his hand. "We'll take it slow and we'll be honest with each other. That's all I ask." It had only been a week since our conversation, and I already felt like I was living in two worlds. During the day, Rob and I continued as we always had, sharing breakfast, going over our schedules, texting each other reminders and little jokes. But at night, when the house was quiet and darkness settled in, my mind was a storm of contradictions. I couldn't ignore the thrill that pulsed through me, the strange sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. The prospect of meeting someone new, of indulging in fresh, unexplored chemistry, was intoxicating. And yet, every time I caught Rob watching me, his gaze searching and uncertain, guilt washed over me, heavy and consuming. One evening, as we lay in bed together, I could feel his eyes on me. I kept my face turned, staring up at the ceiling, unsure how to bridge the distance between us. The bed felt unusually vast, a gulf of unspoken words and tentative desire stretching between us. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to face him, his face cast in soft shadows by the glow of our bedside lamp. I could see the vulnerability there, the worry he was trying so hard to hide, and my heart ached with the weight of it. "Yes," I replied, reaching out to run my fingers over his chest, tracing the familiar lines of muscle beneath his shirt. I've been thinking a lot. About us, about this." His hand covered mine, warm and strong, grounding me. "I know this isn't easy," he said softly, "for either of us." We were silent for a long moment, each of us feeling the gravity of this new, uncertain space we'd opened between us. And then, as if drawn by a magnetic pull, I leaned into him, closing the space between our lips. His mouth met mine in a kiss that was tentative at first, as if he too was navigating this new terrain with equal parts hesitation and longing. But as the kiss deepened, I felt the tension ease, replaced by a surge of heat that seemed to burn away the doubts lingering in the corners of my mind. His hands roamed over me, sliding up my back, pulling me closer, as if he were trying to remind us both of what we had, of the connection that had held us together through years of love and challenges. There was something different in the way he touched me that night, an urgency, a fierceness that hadn't been there before. It was as if he were trying to prove something, to show me that he could be everything I needed, that he could still set my blood on fire. And he did. With every kiss, every caress, he unraveled me, leaving me breathless and wanting, my heart pounding as we lost ourselves in each other. We made love slowly, intensely, each touch filled with an aching need to reclaim what we feared we were losing. His hands traced familiar paths along my body, and yet every sensation felt heightened, electric, like we were rediscovering each other after a long separation. I could feel the weight of his desire, the silent plea in his touch as he held me, his fingers pressing into my skin as if to say, "Don't let go. Don't let this slip away." Afterward, we lay tangled together, our breaths still uneven, our bodies warm and entwined. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling a strange blend of comfort and sadness settle over me. "Are you still sure about this?" he asked quietly, his hand gently stroking my hair. The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me wanted to tell him no, that I didn't need anyone else as long as I had him. But another part, the part that had been awakened by the possibility of something new, something different, wasn't ready to give up that dream. "I think this is something I need to explore," I whispered finally, hating the sadness that flickered across his face at my words. He nodded, his fingers tightening briefly in my hair. "Then I guess we'll take this one day at a time." I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing doubt that crept into my mind. Was I being selfish, chasing a thrill that could cost me everything? Or was this truly the key to finding happiness for both of us? The next evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the hem of my dress, feeling a strange flutter of nerves in my stomach. My hands were slightly shaky, my fingers fidgeting with the fabric as I tried to smooth out imaginary creases. It had been years since I'd gone out on a date, an actual date, with anyone other than Rob. And now, here I was, applying the final touches of lipstick, scrutinizing every detail, feeling like I was preparing for something momentous. The nervousness I felt was almost foreign, a heady blend of anticipation and guilt that twisted in my stomach with every glance in the mirror. Part of me was excited, curious to rediscover this side of myself that had lain dormant for so long. But there was another part, a quieter, uneasy part, that questioned everything I was doing, every choice that had led me to this moment. I smoothed my hair one last time and took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady my nerves. Just as I adjusted the strap on my shoulder, I caught sight of Rob in the mirror's reflection, standing in the doorway behind me. He hadn't said much since I'd told him about the date, and I hadn't offered many details. But now, seeing him standing there, his expression unreadable, I felt a pang of uncertainty, and something even deeper, a twinge of sorrow. His gaze lingered on me, moving from my dress to my face, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite name. There was a heaviness in his posture, a weight that hung in the silence between us, filling the air with unspoken questions and quiet resignation. "You look beautiful," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying an edge of sadness that made my heart ache. I turned to face him, feeling the tension of his words settle over me. He hadn't asked me where I was going or who I was meeting, and part of me was grateful for his restraint. But seeing him standing there, watching me with that mixture of pain and acceptance, I felt the weight of what I was about to do in a way that I hadn't before. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the floor before he looked back up at me. A small, strained smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and he nodded slowly. "I said I'd try, and I meant it," he replied, but his tone was forced, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as he was convincing me. The hollow sound of his words hit me hard, and I found myself at a loss, searching for something, anything, that might ease the tension between us. "Rob, you know that. If this doesn't feel right, we can stop. We don't have to do this." He nodded again, his gaze shifting away from me, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I know," he replied, a hint of resignation in his voice. "But if this is something you need to do, then I'll support you." The sincerity in his words, laced with sorrow and reluctant acceptance, struck me in a way I hadn't expected. I wished I could find the right words to reassure him, to make him understand that this wasn't about replacing him or searching for something better. But the words felt inadequate, too hollow to convey the depth of my feelings. So instead, I crossed the room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, and stood before him, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. Reaching up, I pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, lingering just a little longer, hoping that the gesture might say what words couldn't. His hand brushed against my arm, a subtle but gentle touch that felt like a plea to stay, even as he let me go. As I pulled away, I looked into his eyes, searching for a glimmer of understanding, of acceptance. But all I saw was a quiet resignation, a sadness that mirrored my own. "I'll be back soon," I murmured, hoping the promise might offer some small comfort. He gave a brief nod, his expression softening, and he offered me a faint smile. "I'll be here." With a heavy heart, I turned and walked to the door, forcing myself to take one step after another. I could feel his gaze on me, watching as I left, and with every step, the weight of the moment settled deeper within me. As I reached for the doorknob, I paused, the words lingering on my tongue, but I held back, realizing that there was nothing left to say. And with one last glance over my shoulder, I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me. The bar was warm and dimly lit, a welcome reprieve from the chilly evening air. I spotted him almost immediately, Mark, his name was, sitting at a table by the window, his eyes lighting up as he saw me approach. "Lily?" he asked, standing up to greet me. His smile was warm, genuine, and I felt a rush of relief at his easygoing demeanor. "Yes," I replied, smiling back. "It's nice to meet you." We ordered drinks and settled into a comfortable conversation, discussing our favorite books, travel plans, the little quirks of our jobs. He was funny, charming in a laid-back way, and I found myself laughing more easily than I had in months. But even as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow betraying Rob, that I was stepping into a world that didn't belong to me. And yet, there was something intoxicating about it. The thrill of anonymity, of being seen through fresh eyes. When he reached across the table to take my hand, a thrill shot through me, swift and unexpected. His touch was different, unfamiliar, and that only heightened the sense of excitement coursing through me. "Would you like to go somewhere quieter?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. For a moment I hesitated, glancing down at our entwined hands. Part of me wanted to say yes, to follow this impulse and see where it led. But another part, the part tethered to Rob, held me back. "I think I should get going," I said finally, offering him an apologetic smile. He nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. No pressure." As I walked back to my car, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The thrill, the guilt, the sense of freedom mingling with a deep-seated fear that I was treading dangerous ground. But one thing was clear. The world had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things were. When I arrived home, I paused on the doorstep, taking a steadying breath before unlocking the door. The weight of the evening hung over me, a strange mixture of exhilaration and guilt that I wasn't sure how to process. I hadn't expected the evening to feel as freeing as it had, yet as I stood there with the key in my hand, the reality of coming back to Rob, of facing the consequences of what we'd agreed upon, grounded me. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and there he was, waiting. He was sitting on the edge of the armchair, leaning slightly forward, his gaze steady and watchful. A quiet intensity radiated from him, a mixture of anticipation and unease. His eyes locked onto mine as I entered, and he didn't say a word. He simply watched me, his expression carefully composed, but I could see the flicker of vulnerability beneath his calm facade. There was a quiet question in his gaze, a silent plea for reassurance, and it tugged at something deep inside me. "How was it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he feared the answer. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "It was nice," I replied, knowing even as I said it that the word fell flat, inadequate to capture the complexity of what I had felt. How could I possibly explain the blend of excitement and confusion that had surged within me, the way it felt both thrilling and terrifying to explore this new side of myself? His eyes searched mine, his face unreadable. I could see the struggle there, the turmoil he was trying so hard to contain. I felt the urge to reassure him, to tell him that nothing had changed, that he was still the one I wanted to come home to, the one who mattered most. But the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between my heart and my throat, leaving me standing there, helpless in the face of his quiet pain. We stood there, facing each other in the dimly lit hallway, a silence filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't put into words. The weight of it all, the choices we'd made, the uncertainties we faced, hung heavily between us, pressing down like a tangible force. As if sensing my hesitation, Rob crossed the space between us in a few steps, reaching out to pull me into his arms. His hold was tight, almost desperate, as if he feared that letting go might mean losing me altogether. I felt the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, and in that moment, the tension between us melted away, replaced by a shared vulnerability that words could never express. I sank into him, letting his arms wrap around me, feeling the way he held on just a little too tightly, as though grounding himself, reminding himself that I was still here. My face pressed against his shoulder, and I closed my eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of him, the comfort of his presence. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt right again, as if we were still the same couple we had always been, untouched by the choices that had brought us to this point. His hand moved to my back, tracing gentle circles, and I could feel the subtle tremor in his touch, the quiet intensity that simmered beneath his steady exterior. It was as though he was searching for something in me, a reassurance that I was still his, that the bond we shared hadn't been broken. "Lily," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, barely audible in the stillness of the hallway. "Tell me this won't change us." The words broke something inside me, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. I wanted to promise him that nothing would change, that we would find our way through this together. But the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if the path we'd chosen would bring us closer or if it would slowly erode the love we had fought so hard to build. I didn't know if exploring this new side of ourselves would deepen our bond or drive us further apart. So instead, I held him closer, letting my silence speak for me, hoping he would understand that this journey was as uncertain for me as it was for him. "I'm here, Rob," I whispered finally, my voice barely more than a breath. "I'm still here." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him before. There was a sadness there, a quiet fear that he couldn't quite mask, and it cut deeper than any words could have. He lifted a hand to my face, his fingers gentle as they brushed against my cheek, tracing a path that was both familiar and infinitely precious. "Promise me," he said softly, his voice trembling with the weight of the request. "Promise me that this won't change the way we feel about each other." I felt the sting of tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "I promise," I said, though the words felt fragile, as if they might shatter under the weight of everything we'd taken on. "I promise, Rob." He nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at his lips, and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, his touch both tender and bittersweet. I could feel the quiet desperation in his kiss, the way he clung to me as if anchoring himself to the life we'd shared, the life that was now shifting beneath our feet. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, both of us holding on with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, as though we could somehow ward off the unknown simply by refusing to let go. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much we promised, no matter how much we tried to reassure each other, the truth was that we were stepping into uncharted territory, a journey that would test us in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. But for now, in the quiet of the hallway, I held on to him, grounding myself in the familiarity of his embrace, in the steady beat of his heart, and I let myself believe, if only for a moment, that we could weather this storm together. The next morning, an awkward silence lingered between us as Rob and I went through our usual routine. The comfortable rhythm of our relationship felt subtly altered, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn between us overnight. As we stood in the kitchen, the sounds of coffee brewing and toast popping seemed louder than usual, filling the gaps in our conversation. I caught Rob glancing at me more than once, his gaze intense and searching, as though he were trying to read my mind, to unravel the feelings I was struggling to keep buried. "What's on your mind?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. I hesitated, unsure of how to put my conflicting emotions into words. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him that the date hadn't changed anything, that he was still the one I wanted to come home to. But another part of me, the part that had felt exhilarated and alive last night, wasn't ready to let go of the thrill. "It was just different," I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything more than talk, but it made me feel things I haven't felt in a long time. I don't know how to explain it." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice soft but edged with tension. "How do you feel about us?" I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. He was asking for reassurance, and I wanted to give it to him, to make him feel safe in the love we had built together. But I also knew that I couldn't ignore my own desires, the parts of me that longed for something new. "I love you, Rob," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "That hasn't changed. But this is something I feel like I need to explore. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I think it could help us both grow, in ways we haven't before." He held my gaze, his fingers tightening around mine. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a willingness to try, even if he wasn't fully convinced. "Then maybe we need to find a way to do this together," he said quietly, his tone a mixture of resignation and determination. "If this is going to be part of our lives, maybe we need to be open with each other, share our experiences." The suggestion took me by surprise, and a flicker of excitement mixed with trepidation passed through me. The idea of sharing this part of ourselves, of being completely honest and vulnerable, was both thrilling and terrifying, but it also felt like a way to bridge the gap between us, to keep our connection alive amidst the unknown. "All right," I replied, nodding slowly. "We'll be open with each other, about everything." A small smile tugged at his lips, though it was tinged with sadness. "Then maybe we can start over in a way." That night, as we lay in bed, the unspoken tension was palpable, crackling in the air between us. I could feel his eyes on me, his hand resting lightly on my hip, and I sensed the unasked questions hanging in the silence. Turning toward him, I met his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a raw honesty that mirrored my own. And in that moment, it felt like we were both standing on the edge of something new and uncertain. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from my face, his touch gentle but deliberate. "I want to know what you felt last night," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to understand." The request caught me off guard, but there was a part of me that wanted to share it, to let him into the feelings I had experienced. Leaning closer, I pressed a soft kiss to his lips, hoping that through touch, I could convey what words couldn't. As our kisses deepened, a familiar warmth spread between us, the kind of intimacy we had shared countless times before. But this time, there was a new urgency, an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. It was as if we were trying to claim each other, to solidify the bond that had been stretched thin by this new reality. His hands roamed over me, his touch more possessive than usual, as though he were trying to reaffirm his place in my heart, to remind us both of the love we shared. I responded eagerly, matching his intensity, letting my own emotions spill over in the rawness of our connection. "Lily," he whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with a longing that sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't want to lose you." The words struck deep, and I felt a surge of tenderness as I held him close, my fingers threading through his hair. "You won't," I murmured, hoping the promise in my voice was enough to quiet his doubts. In that moment, as we moved together, every touch, every whispered word, felt like a vow, a promise to hold on to what we had, even as we ventured into the unknown. But beneath the passion, I could feel the shadow of uncertainty, a question that neither of us dared to voice. Would love be enough to hold us together, or were we bound to drift apart in the search for something more? As the days passed, Rob and I fell into a delicate balance, carefully navigating our new arrangement. We agreed to set boundaries, to communicate openly about our experiences, and to prioritize our relationship above all else. It was a fragile peace, one that felt like it could shatter with the slightest misstep, but it was a peace nonetheless. One evening, Rob came home later than usual, his face flushed, his eyes bright with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in a long time. I could tell, even before he spoke, that something had changed. "I went out for a drink after work," he said, his voice hesitant, as if he were testing the waters. "I met someone. Her name is Claire." The words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling within me: jealousy, curiosity, and a flicker of excitement at the thought of Rob experiencing the same thrill I had felt. I forced myself to keep my voice steady, to let go of the possessiveness that clawed at me. "How was it?" I asked, my tone as casual as I could manage. He hesitated, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It was nice, different. I felt like I could be someone else for a moment. I don't know how to explain it." I nodded, understanding all too well. "And did you?" He shook his head, a hint of relief and amusement in his eyes. "No, nothing like that. We just talked, but it felt good to be seen in a new way, to feel excited again. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of solidarity with him, as if we were both participants in an experiment that only the two of us could understand. There was a comfort in that shared experience, a reassurance that we were in this together. And yet, as I watched him recount his evening with Claire, a new question began to take root in my mind. A question that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Was this thrill worth the risk we were taking? And if we continued down this path, where would it lead us? As the weeks went by, Rob and I continued to explore, each of us dipping our toes into new experiences while trying to maintain the bond we had built. We had nights filled with passion, where our connection felt stronger than ever, but we also had moments of tension, where jealousy and insecurity bubbled beneath the surface. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of Rob's breathing, wondering if we were on the verge of something beautiful or something catastrophic. I wanted to believe that this journey would bring us closer, that it would help us rediscover ourselves and each other. But I couldn't ignore the growing distance, the subtle cracks that seemed to widen with each passing day. One evening, after returning from another date with Mark, I found Rob sitting alone in the darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The shadows played across his face, highlighting the weariness in his eyes. "Hey," I murmured, sitting down beside him. "Are you okay?" He stared into his glass, his fingers tapping against the rim. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "Sometimes. I wonder if this is what I really want. If any of this is worth it." A pang of guilt twisted in my chest, and I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "Rob, we don't have to do this. If it's too much, we can stop." He looked at me, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "But this was what you wanted, wasn't it? To feel alive again, to explore something new." "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But not at the cost of losing you." He sighed, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back against the couch. "I just don't know how to feel. Some days I think I can handle it. Other days I feel like I'm watching us drift apart." The words cut deep, and I felt the weight of our choices settle heavily between us. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now we were left to navigate the consequences, unsure of where they would lead. As I held him close, feeling the quiet desperation in his embrace, I realized that this journey was as much about finding ourselves as it was about finding our way back to each other. And I could only hope that in the end, we'd emerge stronger, with a love that could weather any storm. The weeks following our agreement to open our marriage were a strange, dizzying blend of excitement and insecurity. I was discovering new facets of myself, but I was also seeing sides of Rob that I hadn't expected, vulnerabilities that weren't always easy to witness, and moments of frustration that simmered beneath the surface. One particular Friday night, after a long week at work, I found myself sitting in our kitchen, staring into a glass of wine and letting my thoughts wander. Rob had mentioned he would be going out with Claire, the woman he'd met a few weeks back. I had tried to act casual, supportive, encouraging even, but as the night wore on, I felt the gnawing, insistent presence of jealousy creeping in. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the dark red liquid cling to the sides. Thoughts of him with her filled my mind, painting pictures I hadn't prepared myself for. In those moments, the words I'd spoken to him weeks earlier about freedom and exploration felt hollow, almost naive. Why had I thought this would be easy? Why had I believed that love alone could guard us against these inevitable emotions? The sound of the front door opening jolted me from my thoughts, and I turned to see Rob entering, his face flushed from the cool night air. He looked surprised to find me sitting there, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other, the weight of our unspoken feelings hanging thickly between us. "Hey," he said, setting his keys down on the counter and offering me a tentative smile. "Hey," I replied, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. He poured himself a glass of water, glancing at me over the rim as he drank. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone cautious, almost hesitant. I nodded, but the words I wanted to say felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I gave him a small, forced smile. "Did you have a good time?" He looked at me, his eyes searching my face as though trying to read the emotions I was keeping hidden. "Yeah, it was nice," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. The simple statement, innocent as it was, sent a pang through my chest. I hated how much it affected me, how the thought of him enjoying himself with someone else stirred up insecurities I hadn't even realized I was holding. "That's good," I said, hoping my voice sounded steady. "I'm glad." He hesitated, setting down his glass and coming closer, his expression shifting from guarded to concerned. "Lily," he said softly, reaching out to take my hand. "Are you sure you're okay with this? Because if you're not, we don't have to keep going." I forced a smile, brushing my thumb over his hand in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. "I just need to get used to it, that's all. This is new for both of us." He nodded, his fingers tightening around mine. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he could sense the turmoil simmering beneath my calm facade. That weekend, I decided to meet up with Mark again, hoping that a second date might provide the clarity I was seeking. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse that was a bit more daring than my usual style, hoping to recapture the excitement I had felt on our first date. I wanted to feel desirable, wanted to be reminded of the thrill I'd been seeking. We met at a small, dimly lit restaurant, and he greeted me with a warm smile that made me feel instantly at ease. As we settled into conversation, I found myself laughing more freely, allowing myself to enjoy the moment without the weight of my own doubts. "You seem different tonight," he remarked at one point, his gaze lingering on me with a quiet curiosity. I smiled, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. "Different how?" "I don't know," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "More yourself, I guess. Less hesitant." His words struck a chord, and I realized that I was finally starting to feel the freedom I had been searching for. It was a strange, exhilarating feeling, one that made me feel both empowered and strangely untethered. As the night wore on, we found ourselves leaning closer, the chemistry between us building in a way that felt both exciting and surreal. At one point, he reached across the table, brushing his fingers over my hand in a gesture that sent a thrill through me. "Do you want to go somewhere quieter?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. I hesitated, a mixture of excitement and guilt twisting in my chest. Part of me wanted to say yes, to let myself be swept up in the moment. But another part, the part still tethered to Rob, held me back. "I think maybe we should take things slow," I replied, offering him a small, apologetic smile. He nodded, his expression understanding, but I could see a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Of course, whatever you're comfortable with." I felt a surge of gratitude for his patience, even as a pang of guilt lingered in the back of my mind. As we parted ways later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't quite ready to step into. A world of desires and complications that I wasn't sure I was prepared to navigate. When I arrived home, Rob was waiting, his gaze quiet and watchful as I stepped through the door. There was a tension in the air, a silent question hanging between us that neither of us seemed ready to ask. "How was it?" he asked, his tone careful, as though he were bracing himself for an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "It was nice," I replied, feeling the inadequacy of the word even as I said it. "We had a good time." He nodded, his expression guarded, and I could see the flicker of jealousy in his eyes, a shadow that mirrored the insecurities I had felt the night he went out with Claire. "I'm glad," he said, but there was a tightness in his voice that told me he was struggling to believe it. We stood there in silence, the tension thickening between us, until finally, he closed the distance between us, his hand reaching out to touch my face. There was a desperation in his touch, a silent plea for reassurance that tugged at my heart. "Lily," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't want to lose you." The words struck deep, and I felt a surge of tenderness as I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close. "You won't," I whispered, hoping the promise in my voice was enough to quiet his doubts. But as we stood there, holding each other in the dim light of our living room, I couldn't ignore the growing divide between us, the subtle cracks that seemed to widen with each passing day. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now we were left to navigate the consequences, unsure of where they would lead. In the weeks that followed, Rob and I continued to explore the boundaries of our arrangement, each of us venturing further into unfamiliar territory. There were nights when I found myself lying awake, wondering if we were heading towards something beautiful or something catastrophic. The thrill of new experiences was exhilarating, but it was tempered by a growing unease, a fear that we were losing each other in the process. One evening, after another date with Mark, I found myself in his apartment, a glass of wine in hand as we sat on his couch, our conversation drifting from casual banter to something more intimate. The attraction between us was undeniable, a magnetic pull that made it increasingly difficult to resist. At one point, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face, his touch gentle but insistent. "Lily," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I've wanted to kiss you all night." My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of excitement and guilt swirling within me. Part of me wanted to give in, to let myself be swept up in the moment, but another part, the part still tied to Rob, held me back. "I can't," I whispered, pulling away even as my body protested. He nodded, his expression understanding, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes that left me feeling torn. As I left his apartment that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, a world of desires and complications that I wasn't sure I was prepared to navigate. The thrill of new experiences was exhilarating, but it was tempered by a growing unease, a fear that I was losing myself in the process. Back at home, Rob was waiting, his expression tense as he watched me step through the door. There was a strain in his eyes, a silent accusation that made my heart ache. "Did you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied quickly, shaking my head. "I couldn't. It didn't feel right." He let out a small sigh of relief, but there was still a lingering sadness in his eyes, a doubt that I couldn't quite dispel. "Lily," he said quietly, reaching out to take my hand. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I thought I could handle it, but it's tearing me apart." The confession struck deep, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. I had wanted freedom, excitement, a chance to rediscover myself, but I hadn't anticipated the toll it would take on him, on us. "I don't want to lose you," he continued, his voice breaking, "but I can't keep pretending that this doesn't hurt." I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close as tears filled my eyes. "I'm sorry, Rob. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought this was something we both wanted." He nodded, his fingers tightening around mine. "Maybe it was," he whispered, "but I think we've both changed." As we stood there, holding each other in the quiet darkness, I realized that our journey had brought us to a breaking point, a crossroads that would force us to confront the choices we had made. I didn't know if we would come out of it stronger or if this would be the end of us, but I knew one thing for certain. We could never go back to the way things were. That night, after Rob's confession, we stayed close, holding each other as though letting go would sever a fragile thread keeping us tethered together. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, layered with the guilt, sadness, and undeniable love we still shared. I could feel his heartbeat beneath my hand, strong and steady, but his breathing was unsteady, as though he were holding something back. "Lily," he murmured, his voice a mix of yearning and sorrow. "I don't know if we can keep going like this, but I know I don't want to lose you." I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, feeling a depth of love and longing that I hadn't felt in years. The flicker of desire that passed between us was as powerful as it was unexpected. It wasn't the playful, effortless passion of our early days, but something rawer, more vulnerable. I could see the hunger in his eyes, a need for reassurance, for closeness, as if he wanted to bridge the distance our choices had created. Without a word, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, but quickly deepened. He responded immediately, his hands moving to my waist, pulling me closer as our kisses grew more fervent. I felt his fingers threading through my hair, tugging me to him with a desperation that left me breathless. There was a silent plea in his touch, a need to reclaim what we'd once had and perhaps what we'd lost. Our movements grew more urgent, each kiss, each caress, fueled by a shared longing to find comfort and reassurance in each other. His lips trailed down my neck, leaving a path of warmth that sent shivers across my skin. I felt his breath, hot and unsteady, as he pressed his face into my shoulder, his hands exploring me with a reverence that made my heart ache. This was no longer just about desire. It was about holding on to the love that had been slipping through our fingers. "Lily," he whispered against my skin, his voice breaking. "I need you. I need to feel close to you." My heart pounded as I held him tighter, running my fingers through his hair, feeling the tension in his body slowly release as he surrendered to the intimacy we both craved. There was a vulnerability in his touch, a quiet desperation that reminded me of how deeply we were both hurting. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to give him everything, to reassure him that no matter what had changed, I was still here. We were still here. As we lay together, our movements became slower, more deliberate, as if savoring each second, each touch. Every brush of his hand across my skin, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a promise to hold on, to rebuild the connection we had risked in the pursuit of something more. Afterward, we lay tangled together, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. He held me close, his arms wrapped tightly around me, as though he were afraid to let go. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded us for so long. But even as we lay there, wrapped in the warmth of our shared vulnerability, I couldn't ignore the lingering questions in my mind. Was this enough? Could our love withstand the strain we had placed on it? Or had we set ourselves on a path that would eventually tear us apart? The next morning, I woke to find Rob already awake, watching me with a thoughtful expression. His hand rested lightly on my back, his fingers tracing gentle circles that sent a warmth spreading through me. "Morning," I murmured, shifting closer to him, enjoying the comfort of his touch. He smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Morning." For a while, we lay there in silence, content to simply be in each other's presence. But as the memories of the night before came flooding back, I felt a pang of uncertainty. Had our closeness been enough to bridge the gap that had grown between us, or was it just a temporary reprieve? "Last night," I began, my voice trailing off as I searched for the right words. "It was what we both needed," he replied softly, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. "But I don't think it's enough to erase everything that's happened." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. "I know. But I want to believe that we can find a way to move forward, to rebuild what we had." He sighed, pulling me closer, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. "I want that too, Lily. More than anything." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, each of us clinging to the hope that love would be enough to carry us through. But deep down, I knew that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, that the choices we had made would continue to test us in ways we couldn't yet foresee. As the days passed, Rob and I began to have the conversations we had been avoiding for so long. We talked about the pain, the jealousy, the confusion that had surfaced in the wake of our open marriage. It was painful, raw, and uncomfortably honest, but it was also liberating in a way that allowed us to face the realities of our relationship. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I felt a wave of emotion rise within me, and before I knew it, the words tumbled out. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you regret everything we've done?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I don't know if regret is the right word," he replied slowly, "but I do wonder if we would have been better off without all of this, if we would have been happier just being content with what we had." The honesty of his answer struck me deeply, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I thought this would help us," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I thought we could find a way to grow, to experience something new without losing each other." He reached out, taking my hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles over my skin. "Maybe it's possible to want something and not be ready for it," he said quietly. Maybe we both wanted freedom, but we didn't realize the cost. As his words sank in, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. We had both been searching for something, hoping to find fulfillment in the exploration of new boundaries, but in the process, we had lost sight of the love that had brought us together. In that moment, I knew that we needed to make a choice, to either continue down this path, facing the challenges and uncertainties that came with it, or to let go of the experiment and recommit to each other fully and completely. "I want us to find a way back," I whispered, feeling a sense of clarity settle over me. "I want to rebuild what we've lost." He looked at me, his expression softening, a flicker of hope shining in his eyes. "Then let's start here now," he replied, pulling me into his arms. "Let's hold on to each other and find a way to heal." In the following days, Rob and I worked to rekindle the closeness we had once shared, rebuilding our intimacy with a newfound understanding and a commitment to open communication. We spent more time together, rediscovering the parts of each other that we had taken for granted, finding joy in the simplicity of each other's presence. There were still moments of doubt, of course, moments when I felt the familiar ache of longing for the excitement of something new. But each time those feelings surfaced, I reminded myself of the love we were fighting to preserve, the bond that had sustained us through every challenge we had faced. As we lay together one evening, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. I knew that our journey was far from over, that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and uncertainties. But I also knew that we were stronger for having faced those challenges, that our love was worth fighting for. And in that quiet moment, I realized that I was ready to let go of the thrill, the desire for something more, and recommit to the man who had been my partner, my lover, my best friend. It began subtly at first, a change in Rob's demeanor that I couldn't quite place. He was quieter, more distant, and when he did speak, his words carried a hard edge that hadn't been there before. I'd notice him watching me, his gaze lingering, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold calculation that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was still processing everything, that he was struggling just as I was. But as the days went by, his behavior grew more unpredictable, his once gentle nature giving way to something darker, something that left me feeling as though I were sharing my home with a stranger. One evening, I came home after spending time with friends, and I found Rob sitting in the living room, a drink in hand, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, a glint of anger, of resentment, that made my heart race with a mix of dread and confusion. "Have a good time?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a bite to his words that put me on edge. "Yes," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just catching up with everyone. It was nice." He nodded slowly, swirling his drink in his glass, his gaze fixed on me in a way that felt almost confrontational. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking a lot about our arrangement, this idea you had about freedom, exploration, and I think I understand now." "Understand what?" I asked cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand that you wanted this for yourself, that you wanted to experience things you felt were missing. But did you ever think about how that might feel for me? Watching you go out, watching you come back with that look in your eyes, knowing you've been somewhere else? With someone else?" I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. I had tried to be mindful, tried to reassure him at every turn, but I realized now that no amount of reassurance could erase the hurt that had taken root within him. "Rob, I never wanted to hurt you," I said quietly. "I thought this was something we could navigate together, something that could bring us closer." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Closer? Is that what you think this has done?" His voice grew sharper, the hurt and anger bubbling to the surface. "Do you know what it feels like to see your wife pursuing other men, to feel like you're no longer enough?" I reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away, his expression hardening. "You opened this door, Lily. You wanted freedom, excitement, to explore new things. Well, maybe it's time I start exploring a little too. I froze, a chill settling over me as his words sank in. Rob, I thought we agreed to do this together, with honesty and respect. Oh, I'll be honest, he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. And I'll be respectful, but I think it's time you see what it's like to be on the other side of this arrangement. Over the next few days, Rob's behavior shifted in ways that left me on edge, uncertain of what he was planning. He began staying out late, coming home at odd hours with an air of indifference that unsettled me. He would disappear without explanation, leaving me to wonder where he was, who he was with, what he was doing. I tried to confront him one evening, my patience worn thin by the silence, the distance he'd placed between us. Rob, if you're angry with me, please just say so. This silent treatment, this avoidance, it's not helping. He looked at me, a small mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You think I'm avoiding you, Lily? No, I'm just following your lead. Living life, embracing freedom, isn't that what you wanted? His words cut deep, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. I realized then that he wasn't simply reacting. He was punishing me. He wanted me to feel the same pain, the same jealousy that had consumed him since we'd opened our marriage. And as much as I wanted to defend myself, to remind him that this had been something we'd agreed on, I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me, the feeling that I had brought this upon us. In the days that followed, Rob's behavior grew more deliberate, his actions carefully calculated to provoke a reaction. He would come home with the faint scent of perfume on his clothes, leaving traces of his outings for me to find, each one a silent reminder that he was out there, doing exactly what I had done. One evening, as I was folding laundry, I found a small, unmistakable smear of lipstick on the collar of his shirt, a shade I had never worn. The sight of it sent a jolt of anger and hurt through me, a mirror of the emotions I had so carelessly dismissed in him. I realized then that Rob wasn't simply exploring his own freedom. He was getting back at me, one subtle blow at a time. I couldn't hold back any longer. That night, as he walked through the door, I confronted him, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. Rob, are you trying to hurt me? He looked at me, his expression cold, unfeeling. Hurt you? No, Lily. I'm just giving you a taste of your own medicine. The words stung, sharper than any insult. This isn't what I wanted, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were doing this together, with honesty. But you're trying to get back at me. He stepped closer, his gaze intense, unwavering. Maybe I am. Or maybe I just finally understand what it feels like to be free, to not worry about what you think every second of the day. I could feel tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Rob, this isn't about freedom. This is revenge. He shrugged, an indifferent look crossing his face. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just my way of finding myself again, after everything you put me through. The bitterness in his voice cut deep, and I felt a wave of regret wash over me, mingling with the anger and hurt that had been building for weeks. I had wanted excitement, freedom, but I hadn't anticipated the price we'd pay, the rift it would create between us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If you're doing this to hurt me, then you've succeeded. I'm hurt, Rob. I'm hurt and angry and afraid. I'm afraid of what we're becoming. He looked away, his expression softening for the briefest of moments, as though he too felt the weight of what we were doing to each other. But just as quickly, the hardness returned, and he turned his back on me, his silence a painful reminder of the distance that now separated us. The weeks that followed were a haze of cold stares, silent dinners, and a growing sense of resentment that hung heavily in the air. Rob continued to play his game, each new detail, a forgotten text, a late-night phone call, a hint of lipstick, carefully orchestrated to remind me of his newfound freedom. And I, in turn, found myself spiraling, consumed by jealousy and regret. The excitement I had once felt had been replaced by a hollow ache, a longing for the love and trust we had once shared. I realized too late that my desire for freedom had cost me more than I'd ever anticipated. One evening, as Rob returned home after yet another unexplained absence, I could no longer hold back. I confronted him, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Rob, I can't do this anymore," I said, my tone raw, unguarded. "I can't keep living like this, pretending that this revenge game is somehow fair. We're tearing each other apart." He looked at me, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, but his expression remained guarded. "This is what you wanted, Lily. This was your idea. Don't blame me for following your lead." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I brushed it away, refusing to let him see the full extent of my pain. Maybe it was my idea, but this isn't what I wanted. I wanted us to grow, to find something more, but all we've found is resentment. For the first time, I saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man I had once known. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took mine. "Lily," he murmured, his voice softening. "I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if we can ever go back." The honesty in his voice shattered me, and I felt the weight of our choices settle over me like a heavy shroud. We had wanted freedom, excitement, a chance to explore, but we had underestimated the cost. And now, as we stood on the precipice of our relationship, I realized that we had both lost something far more precious than we had ever anticipated. As we held each other in the quiet darkness, the only sound our uneven breaths, I knew that our journey was far from over. But I also knew that the love we had once shared, the trust, the closeness, was something we could never truly reclaim. And in that heartbreaking moment, I understood that we had both paid the ultimate price for the choices we had made.